Well, good morning. This is the Lou Rockwell Show, and now great to have as our guest this morning Professor Peter Dale Scott. Professor Scott is a former Canadian diplomat, professor of English at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a poet, a researcher, and it's especially in his role as a researcher that we're talking to him today. He's the author of four very important books, one of which is coming out in November, in fact, can be pre-ordered now, and that's what I want to talk to him about today. The American Deep State, Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. Again, it's going to be published in November, but you can pre-order it on Amazon right now. Professor Scott, we hear about, once in a while you hear that maybe Turkey has a deep state, or maybe some other foreign country has a deep state, but surely in the indispensable nation, we wouldn't have such a thing. But tell us, what it is, why it's important, and why really every American who cares about liberty and civil liberties, economic liberties, privacy, peace, any of the important issues of our time, should be reading your book and care about these issues very, very much.
I do think that the issue of the deep state is as important as you just suggested, and that understanding it is a first step in order to deal with all of our problems. But since you brought up Turkey, it's very relevant. The term deep state did actually originate there, where they had, I think, a better defined problem, a very severe one, which was that the government, from time to time, which was ostensibly civilian and had elections, the government would be overthrown by a coup or by selective assassinations, and there was a structure in the country that was, and by the way, a structure which some people say was set up with CIA assistance, a kind of Turkish equivalent of Gladio that we had in Italy and Belgium and other countries, that was directing the political system and intervening whenever necessary in a very violent way. Another situation like that would be Colombia, where you had these parapolitical death squads, the Guardias Secuestradores. What we have in America is not as extreme and as structured as that. I make a point of saying in my book that it's not an alternative structure to the state. It is more like a system that really from the beginning of American politics has been present, and to a greater or less degree has also been interfering and getting its way. I decided to call the book The American Deep State after another researcher, Mike Lofgren, did a very good article and shared it on radio, Bill Moyer's show, back in January. And I had originally thought of focusing my book on something else, but I think it is time to recognize that whereas most of our state, the public state, is subject to checks and balances, is governed by the Constitution, we have set up agencies which are not subject to the same kind of control. And the two most obvious are the NSA and the CIA, which are major parts of the deep state I'm talking about, but by no means all of it, because I'm thinking of these unchecked agencies, but also of powerful elements in the country that have special access to particularly the CIA. And that's why I made a point of mentioning Wall Street and Big Oil in the subtitle of the book, because they are very well represented in the CIA. You could really say, I give a very brief historical account of the setting up of the CIA, which I did in more detail in two earlier books, The Road to 9/11 and American War Machine, that it was essentially an idea that came out of Wall Street. Truman was very reluctant to have a big spy agency like this. He had closed down OSS, and it was pressure from Wall Street that persuaded him to do it, and he accepted a blueprint for the CIA, which had essentially been drawn up by Allen Dulles and a few other Wall Street bankers and lawyers in New York rather than in Washington. So that's why it's a central part of the deep state. But as I say, the deep state is a system and not a structure. And when we come, Mike Lofgren compared the deep state to an iceberg, and he said we see the visible 10%, and down below it is the really important 90%. That's a good metaphor in a way, but what's bad about it is it suggests that the 90% is as structured as the 10%, and it really isn't. It's more informal. People know each other. There's a milieu, but they have access to power through the CIA and through other means. Recently, we have a problem with the outsourcing of intelligence because something like 70% of the intelligence budget now, which has been huge since 9/11, is outsourced and goes to private corporations like Booz Allen Hamilton and SAIC. And these are run by in and outers, people who will do a stint as head of the CIA. And then they sometimes come from Booz Allen Hamilton, they go back to Booz Allen Hamilton. The result is that the intelligence budget is not something that Congress really has control of, and that's been true since the beginning of the CIA. They've always had access to funds that were not voted by Congress, and that's why they've always had powers that are not part of the constitutional structure of this country.
Professor, is that why we see so much evidence of the CIA's involvement in the international drug trade as a way to make money?
Yes. I talk more about that in American War Machine. Yes, it's very relevant. It's also relevant, I think, that the money doesn't go into the CIA bank accounts as far as I can see. It just means that the CIA will hook up with powerful elements in other countries that become essentially like local armies for the CIA, but the CIA doesn't have to pay for them because they are funded by drugs. And that was certainly true of the Contras in the early stages of the Contra operations down in Nicaragua. But it isn't just the CIA that has an interest then in the drug traffic. Wall Street, too. They're beginning to crack down on this now, but for a long time, the big Wall Street banks had special private banks that dealt in the laundering of drug profits. And this drug money was a major factor for Wall Street. It enabled, for example, Wall Street to make loans to countries on the assumption that countries would be able to pay them back because of the amount of money being made from drugs in those countries. It's a very complicated story, and I could go on and on about it because it's an interest of mine, but that is not very much talked about in this particular book. It's mentioned, but not very much.
I was interested when you said that this goes back to the beginning of the American government, but really metastasized after World War II, as you say, with the founding of the CIA. And have there been any opponents whose names you might have heard of anyway of this process? You're an opponent, obviously. There are other important intellectual opponents. Anybody in politics who's opposed this?
I think every country or every major country has a deep state, and it's not so much I'm an opponent of it, but I'm an opponent of its being so secret that nobody is checking it. I just want us to understand what's going on in this country better. As a former diplomat, I understand that there has to be secrecy in certain matters, but secrecy that is totally unchecked sort of takes over. And where you have complete secrecy, you don't have democracy. You can't have both. So have there been any political opponents? I think it was a very important moment back in the Iran-Contra hearings, and some people may remember this. Oliver North was being quizzed by this special committee, and Congressman Jack Brooks from Texas, said he had just read an article by Alfonso Chardy in the Miami Herald that said that there was a parallel government that was planning for suspension of the Constitution. And I think the whole of Congress should have been in an uproar about that. But in fact, it was just one man. And in this committee, Colonel North, I understand that you've been part of a committee that is planning for the suspension of the American Constitution. Could you tell us something about that? And there was a brief discussion between the North's lawyer and the chairman of the